brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village at Britain, the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead. All right, guys. So I believe we're in episode 52, and we just, we've talked about starting a little cycle about hospitality.
Well, humans are a herd animal, so we do better, evolutionary-wise, we do better if we work together. Especially you think of like a baby can't survive on its own, so the community has to take care of it until it gets to be an adult. So just that basic idea is built in.
Right, and I think that's a very valid point, especially considering that reciprocity as a behavior, as a biological behavior, is something that has been studied extensively in various group animals. When a person is needy, whether they are traveling or they're homeless or they're lost or they're orphaned or a stranger arrives to your household, if you aid that stranger's survival, then it is understood that down the road somebody may aid yours. And within most communities, the hospitality behavior oftentimes has a limitation on it. So the idea is you cannot just be a homeless or wandering person, show up at somebody's yurt and expect to live there for the rest of your life. I mean, those things do happen occasionally, but you cannot expect to live for the rest of your life for free. Usually there's a limit for, I know in some cultures, it's a 3-day limit. You can stay for 3 days as a guest, and after that, or just move on, please. And that's reasonable behavior, because otherwise it will be just a way to sap on resources of other groups that are trying to survive as well. But I want to start, Nathan, I'm going to let you jump in just a second, but I just want to start with a very basic question. What is a guest? Let me even simplify that question. What is a door? Does anybody have any thoughts?
Well, when I think of door, I typically think of a threshold. It's,
right.
And it's a marked place where you have an egress and an ingress.
Right, but what does a threshold represent? What it's a threshold? It's a separation between what and what?
Well, outside and inside, or from one section to another. For example, I have many thresholds in this building, and each one kind of has a psychological representation, so to speak. And it's kind of just understood that, like, for example, the front door. You do not cross that threshold unless you are welcomed in.
Right. What we're going to
like
say
in a home, a doorway is the dividing line between the public and the private space.
Right. But if we go a little bit deeper on a mythological level, so let's think about very primitive humans and their very early dwellings, maybe caves or maybe very first huts, where they only have one entrance into the dwelling, and it's the door. We're going to call it the door. It's not the modern door, but it's the entrance way. What does that threshold represent? What's inside and what is outside?
Well, basically, inside is us. This is our space. Right. And the outside is everywhere else.
The hostile world, right? And so in a way, by allowing a guest into your home, you are doing a couple of things, mythologically speaking of, conceptually speaking of. First of all, you are allowing other types of us. In other words, you're offering shelter from the hostile world to other individuals, and by doing so, you're recognizing them as a part of us, which is why the particular ritual of sharing a meal, even if it's very symbolic, even if it's very primitive. For example, you have an electrician over and you ask them, hey, would you like a glass of water? It's a very last vestiges of the idea that if they break bread with you, if they eat your food, then it's a way to stop conflict. It's a way of adopting the individual into a family, even though oftentimes on temporary basis. And some cultures go very far with that. But for the duration of that visit, even an unexpected individual is integrated within the unit and becomes a functional member of that family or of that group that is living within the dwelling.
Actually, can I jump in for just a second? Just to add to the mythology part. Mm-hmm. If we take a look at like the Roman god Janus, he was the god of doorways, but he was also the god of transitions. So I find that fascinating, and that, you know, even in Roman times, which would, you know, for what we're talking about is fairly civilized, you know, we're talking the same god that, you know, kind of overlooked doors was also the god who managed these transitions between life and death, peace and war, civilization, barbarism, and so forth.
Well, and you know, and that makes great sense, because here's the thing: between civilization and wilderness, life and death, barbarism, if we're talking ancient Greek, and civilization, the difference between the threshold between peace and war, all these things, they're all thresholds. And the world outside is full of ghosts, it's full of spirits, it's full of our ancestors and hostile entities. And so, in a way, it's not that different from the other side of life, from the kingdom of death. I wanted to show this ritual, which to this day is fairly prevalent in a lot of Slavic societies, and kind of show you what is done. So when a guest comes to town, in villages in Russia and Ukraine and Belarus and other Slavic villages, oftentimes you would see young ladies that would present something like this. They would have a tray covered with a cloth. It would have a round bread on it, and it would have salt. And you would offer a newcomer to your location, to your village, you would offer them this tray, and they would have to break off a piece of bread and they taste it, and salt the bread and taste it. What does this represent? Of course, breaking bread is pretty self-explanatory. Bread is, in agriculture societies, it's basis of life, it's basis of everything. Why the salt? Well, if your visitor accidentally happens to not be a living person, or not be a human person, or be any sort of other suspicious entity, salt is poison to creatures from the other side. And so, on the one hand, you are honoring your guests with the two most essential products that your society, in case of agricultural society, produces. And that is the, you know, the result of your hard work, and that's the bread. It's the round bread. It represents the sun. And then the salt, which is also a very essential life product, because that's how you preserve all your other foods. But at the same time, they're passing a little test. When you offer that to them, it's actually a little interesting story. Quite a few years ago, when one of the previous prime ministers of Israel and his spouse were visiting Ukraine before the modern nightmare there broke out, they did this because this is Ukrainian, Russian, bunch of other Slavic cultures. They do this thing with the salt and the bread, and they brought out the salt and the bread, and the spouse of the visiting official was not aware of the ritual. She refused to take a piece of bread and taste it, and that caused a real modern day, you know, very westernized society, that caused a real unease among the Ukrainian people. Moreover, to this day, if I happen to have somebody coming over, like a person, even if it's a friend, but more so if it's a stranger, an electrician, I don't know, delivery person who's going to stick around for a while, a cleaning lady, if I offer them a glass of water, something little, if they refuse it completely and adamantly, that makes me feel really uneasy. And so those traditions, I think for a lot of us, think about when you go to your grandparents' house, oftentimes that's the case. Oftentimes, first thing, let's go sit down and eat, right? Would you like a drink? That's what's left as vestigial in the Western society. In the Germanic Russian societies, it's more like, okay, here, sit down at the table, quickly, let me warm something up. Nobody asks you if you're hungry, you better sit down, you better eat, or you're going to be in trouble. That's pretty much what I wanted to say. Nathan, over to you.
There is so much, and again, yes, you're welcome. You know, guest host, you know, dressing the part for hospitality. And there's so much material here that we may have to do additional episodes.
Yeah, that's what I kind of figured.
So what I would like to do is I would like to start by starting to walk back, not necessarily all the way to the fundamental roots of hospitality, but walking back to some shared ancient culture that is actually incredibly important to our contemporary Western culture, and that we hold so dear. It's relatable, and a large part of this relatableness is literature. And we know the stories, we know the characters, we know the people. And there are wonderful examples of hospitality. But I'd like to begin with really a wonderful quote that I found. The law of hospitality is founded upon ambivalence. It imposes through an appeal to the sacred, makes the unknown knowable, and replaces conflict by reciprocal honor. It does not eliminate the conflict altogether. It places in abeyance and prohibits its expression, suppresses a conflict by the prohibition to take offense. Hospitality achieves the same end by the prohibition to give offense, one by forbidding respect and the other by enforcing it. The avoidance of respect and the avoidance of disrespect. Both relationships are placed outside the struggle for supremacy in a tacit agreement enjoyed by custom. Hosts and the guests must pay honor to each other. So in researching this, one of the things that I came across, and it was actually in a very interesting book by an anthropologist, Michael Hertzfeld, and he did a study in Crete in the 1970s. And what he was actually doing was he was actually looking at basically the male's role in culture. And what kind of surprised him was that we often think of hospitality as being the woman's role. No, it's both. It's shared. It's very strongly a male's role, and it's very much the woman's role. It's very much shared, very much enforced upon.
Well, let me just jump in, Nathan, really quick. My understanding that whoever is the head of the household is the one who does the basically performs the hospitality, and also depending on the event in question. For example, if you have a gathering of young women in the spring to sing songs together, then it's probably going to be the senior woman in the household welcoming them. Vice versa, when it's male gatherings, of course, it's going to be the male head of the household. If there's only a widow who is the head of the household, she's going to be the one in charge of doing.
But this also works with groups of men. You think of men having the high testosterone. It's the men that usually start wars. So men have to devise ways of not fighting each other. So in groups of men together, there's also hospitality. It is male and female. It may be slightly different for each, but it's done by both.
Right.
Yes, yeah, and it's and it very much defined how you express hospitality. Defined who you are as a person and how you live with honor. Hospitality and honor it's a code of honor. And through hospitality is a way that honor is practiced. And so Hertzfeld, he went to a small mountainous village in Crete that he dubbed Glendi, or Glendy. And it was a pseudonym, and that was to protect its residents.
Right.
And so he called them Glendians. Mm-hmm. There are pastoral people, but because of their remoteness and just their rough living, they had retained very much these ancient practices of codes of honor that marked that go all the way back through ancient history, ancient times. And one of the things that Hertzfeld describes is about the culture is that the height of the ego, self-regard, is a lavish display of hospitality. He also traced their emphasis on hospitality through their story, all the way back to the ancient Greeks, when it was called xenia, if I'm pronouncing that right. And xenia is an honor-based code of etiquette that concerned the relationships between hosts and guests, and especially if they were strangers to each other. And the stranger they were, the more it was emphasized. So what did this look like back in ancient Greece? Well, a host was expected to welcome into his home anyone who came knocking. Before a host could even ask a guest their name or where he's from, he was to offer the stranger food, drink, and a bath. Only after the guest finished his meal could the host inquire about the visitor's identity. And this is really interesting because strangers and enemies, often the words are very similar to describe them. The host would be expected to offer him gifts and provide him safe escort to his next destination. So guests were in turn to be courteous and respectful to their hosts during their stay. They were not to make demands or be a burden. And very importantly, guests were expected to give the host and his household stories from the outside world, news, information, what's going on. And the most important expectation was that the guest would offer the host the same hospitable treatment should he ever find himself journeying in the guest's homeland. And so how this is, well, first and foremost, relatable to us is we're very familiar with ancient Greek literature and ancient Greek history. And once you start to see how important, or see this concept, how important, you see how important it is to the ancient Greeks. And you see it everywhere in their mythology, in their storytelling. It's all over the place. And I think the best, or one of the primary most relatable examples is the Odyssey. We're all familiar with the story of the Odyssey, and the Odyssey is a story about someone traveling back home through a stranger traveling through strange lands. And it's literally like the Greek Bible on Xenia. And every story in it has something to teach about either neglecting or upholding these tenets. So Circe turning Odysseus's men into pigs, that was bad. The Cyclops eating Odysseus's men, okay, that's bad, but look at what brought that on. Odysseus and his men go into Cyclops's cave, unwelcomed, uninvited, and they're eating him out of house and home. And that's also really bad. The Phaeacians giving Odysseus a banquet and gifts, that's really good. The suitors that are back at Odysseus's home, and they're mooching off his wealth and trying to take his wife, while he's gone. That's really bad. And also they're staying a lot longer than 3 days. That's
Right.
also really bad.
Nathan, I just wanted to jump in real quick and just say that you use the term honor, and I just would like to either get a more clear definition of your usage of that term in this particular context, or alternatively argue with that application of that particular term to the idea of hospitality, because hospitality is really not, because honor is oftentimes individual. Let me rephrase that. It's not individual, it's sometimes ancestral, but this is more about social cohesion. This is foundational. This is not honor. This is not an attribute one can gain or lose. This is essential function of a society. Am I making sense here?
Right. Yes. And it's our people are honorable, and our culture is honorable.
Yeah, it's honorable to uphold the behavior, but the behavior itself is foundational, is what I'm trying to say.
Yes. And but also fundamentally, the practice of hospitality is it's a practical. It has a practical purpose. It's not a moral purpose. And its practical purpose is, again, is to disarm conflict and to disarm potential conflict. And it's also surprisingly long-sighted. It's saying, look, there could be things happening and occurring down the road that it's an investment. And it's a practical investment that we don't know, the earth is made round, so we can't see too far down the road. And we don't know what's coming, so there's a lot of uncertainty. Although with hospitality, you never know when you'll have to draw upon that.
Right, but it may not be the person that you provided for that you're drawing on ultimately is what I'm getting at.
Right. It's your people.
Yep.
Yeah. And it's yourself, it's your people. Strangers are unknown. And so you're essentially welcoming an unknown quality into not just your household, but also to your culture, your people, your village.
And into your mythological space.
Yes. And they can say all they can about themselves. And but you really don't know. And again, you see this. You see this in Greek mythology. You see this in Judeo-Christian texts, where gods or God disguises himself and visits himself upon people to test. Are these people worthy? Even though it's a practical practice, it's not a moral practice. It's very much tied to people's beliefs.
I would disagree that it's not immoral. I think that it's all of the above, because it is a biological system of checks and balances that also at the same time became a physical, practical, functional in form of managing interactions, but then complex societies and a universal language. Really, the very idea of hospitality itself it's like you were saying, it's universally human. Which makes me wonder to what degree it's actually maybe even biologically coded or selected.
Yeah, you think it's just a matter of the way of showing that I don't have a weapon in my hand. Even that by itself is a form of hospitality and conflict prevention, basically.
I wanted to jump in for a moment when there's a spare moment about the mythological part of it too, because I found the salt ritual very interesting, but I think that there are a number of other rituals where that goes in with hospitality. For example, a popular ritual even to this day in the culture that I live around is when you invite somebody into your house, if you know that they are a smoker or whatever, you share smoke or you share drink. It's not just breaking bread. There are a lot of other ways to do it, and it's kind of one of those things. It's a bond. It's a bonding process so that you have mutual trust. Kind of like, okay, so you ate salt on your bread. You are with the living. You are not of the dead.
Right, and like at a mining conference today, in Canada, for example, if you're in the mining business, I'm a non-drinker. If you sit down and don't drink with them, they just won't do business with you. Why is that? It's no different than, let's say, people who smoke weed, especially back in the day before it became legalized. Will you not take a drag of that joint, right? Are you one of us?
Yeah, and what's interesting about like redneck culture, I've learned that they're totally okay if you drink non-alcoholic beer, but they want to see you sitting there with a can of swill in your hand.
This is one of the interesting things, though. So getting back to Hertzfeld and his research in Crete. So and he refers to it as displays of competitive generosity.
Yeah, and I think that's a little bit later on the develop, but I agree with you. That's
right.
Make friendliness, not war.
Right, but and the thing is that they're also at the same time they're demonstrating their qualities to people of the outside world, but they're also competing amongst themselves.
Mm-hmm.
The Glendiot hosts not only vie with each other to how to treat strangers, they also engage in continual competition with each other. In the village houses, meat was often served in a large cauldron, which had been cooked by the women. Its preparation, however, is again begun by the men, who do the initial cutting of the meat with their personal knives. A host who serves only a small amount of meat feels embarrassed, since a meal without meat is not considered a meal at all. At weddings and baptismal feasts, huge amounts of meat and boiled and roast lamb and mutton, roast pork, and sometimes chicken and organ meat are consumed. In serving a smorgasbord of meat, the Glendiot men showed that they knew how to hunt how to steal sheep, which is a big deal, and how to care for and obtain other animals. And in slicing up the meat, they show that they're adept in wielding a knife. This can be seen in ancient Sparta, and each Spartan man was required to eat with his comrades in the, I believe it's a Sistia, his dining club or mess. Once the members of each Sistia had eaten their standard rations, members treated their messmates to food that had to be, as the rules of Sistia dictated, either raised, grown on their lands, or hunted themselves. It could have included, wild game, fruits, vegetables, everything, herbs, nuts, cheeses, breads, whatever. And before serving, they announce, the day's honor to this, grateful to their grateful companions, so they might appreciate their hunting prowess and their skills, their gathering skills and their diligence for them. And so what I found interesting in reading about this contemporary culture in Crete is that it perhaps gives a little insight to how ancient cultures practiced hospitality, and perhaps it was just a little bit more dynamic and a little bit more there's a lot more going on than we're giving it credit for.
No, Nathan, and I think that what you're talking about is a private study, a private look into a very specific, very widespread practice, because a system of interaction that is worldwide, even though there's some variations from one culture to another, slightly, like what is acceptable, what is not, there's some basics to it. And first basic, I think you listed it pretty well, and that's the idea that this is a ritual that is intended to reduce the imminent hostility anytime somebody encroaches on somebody else's territory, because humans in general are very territorial creatures. And it definitely then comes down, if we're talking in a biological sense, if we're not talking about the modern, multi identification sense, but males being the more aggressive, especially early on in history, just more testosterone driven part of the society, so to speak. It was important, of course, for the men to be able to channel their testosterone driven urges into something other than murdering each other, right? In that sense, I think that even in the cultures where the host, so to speak, is not the male of the household, but the female, I think even in that role, the woman, the female, plays a pacifying role, because in a lot of cultures, the household or certain areas of household is solely considered to be the female territory. It's her, that's where she's powerful. Even in cultures that are very male dominant, oftentimes the females have basically dominion over the household, dominion over certain areas of household. And so by making her in charge of the interaction of the two males, the two men are not going to behave aggressively on the woman's turf. Am I making sense?
Well, yeah, it's she's a very an incredibly tempering influence.
She almost becomes a kind of a presiding force over them, and because both of them are outside of their comfort zone, speaking again in mythological terms, even though one man is a resident or multiple men are residents, one may be a visitor, they both are on her territory. So that also, I think, works as a pacifier. But I think, like any etiquette, really, the idea of hospitality is very much designed to minimize and redirect those potential conflicts and urges. It makes me really curious about how early this originated and what was. I'm suspecting, and I'm having a strong suspicion that Neanderthals did not have similar. Because in order to develop that sort of functionality within society, like you said, it's really deep set inside.
I'm sure they did. You go back to, I think it's probably practically dates before humans, even before humans became human. I mean, I think that because we living together as a group, even though we were fairly small groups or family groups, these things would have had to develop, or who wouldn't have survived.
No, I think so, but I think that it became much more. I think it got extended beyond the immediate blood kinship. in
Well, yeah,
human.
it's much more codified now because the structures are getting more and more
More
complicated
complex,
over the
right?
years. But I think I'm sure it's a fundamental core thing when human beings, just so we can get along with other human beings without killing each other all the time.
But it's funny because the same David is going to jump in. I was just going to say that in the same call, because it's funny whom those laws of hospitality do and do not extend to within the same culture, because it seems like there's also built-in codified idea of who is considered to be a guest worthy of hospitality and who is not, and a lot of this behavior is so deeply kind of almost programmed into people that from different cultures that certain taboos are never to be broken. Or if they're broken, the person doing so intuitively knows it. For example, yes, you can come to somebody's house uninvited, unexpected, but in a lot of cultures, the host has to invite, and oftentimes more than once, verbally invite the guest to actually cross the threshold. Moreover, in the traditional dwellings, like a lot of the even if it's a little hut, it would have zones. Like there's the zone that's dedicated to the gods. There's the male zone, female zone, eating zone. There's certain zones that it's instinctively, regardless of what culture a person belongs to, they just don't cross into.
Thinking about how bears are in nature, they're very powerful animals and they can kill just about anything, but they don't fight each other when they meet. They're actually quite civil. I mean, they can fight, but it's
Right.
really rare because they will kill each other. And so they developed that system of I guess hospitality, I suppose.
So here's a couple of things that I wanted to kind of, because I think what we're doing right now is dipping our little toe in the big giant ocean of what hospitality and everything around it. So I would like to point out these topics that I think we should think. This is just off the top of my head. First of all, origins of hospitality. That's a whole big fat. I don't think anybody knows it. Other things that seem to be very closely related to hospitality. One is the idea of food, feasting, sharing food, sharing a valuable, consumptive, the ingestion of something, what I'm saying? Whether it's smoke, whether it's liquor, whether it's, whether it's food. So the idea of food, and also by proxy, by extending that, also feasting as such. The idea of family, because in a lot of traditions, the guest, even if it's for a short period of time, kind of role plays being adopted into the family. In some cultures, they specifically take up a particular role. Like, for example, like you become the big brother, or you become my uncle. So it's almost literal adoption, but it's not permanent adoption. So another thing that seems to be related to is the idea of poverty. And in Christianity, of course, it reached its uttermost heights, but the idea of it kind of spills over into the whole idea of taking care of the poor and so on and so forth. But the idea that any person who can come to your household, no matter how dirty, how I don't know, disgusting, downtrodden they may be,
Slovenly.
they should not, thank you, they should not be turned away. And that spills over into the idea that is completely and entirely universal to all human cultures. And that's the idea that in any stranger knocking on your door at any point in time, it could be a god. And all of these seem to really kind of flow into each other.
There's one other that I wanted to throw in, because you
Mhm.
talked about it in a previous episode. Protection.
Right.
Protecting those who come into your home.
Right, to the point and also the idea of sharing, because like in a lot of biblical stories, for example, early, Hebrew writings, Arabic writings, in Caucasus, hospitality is number one. If you say, what is the number one trait of the people of Caucasus? A lot of people say hospitality. The idea that you put everything on the table. When your guest is there, you pull out your best pieces of meat, your best vegetables. Guest comes over unexpected, maybe, husband's drinking buddy, and the wife puts out not the best food that they have, or not the best liquor. And the husband goes, honey, what are you doing? Come on, bring the real stuff out. And afterwards, it becomes an issue of real embarrassment for the woman who, for example, in this case, who tried to keep the best away from the visitor. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, it's interesting seeing how this pertains to different cultures. I think we've sort of figured out how it all started, but different cultures can handle it differently. Like Arab cultures are very hospitable. The people in the Caucasus are. And I'm thinking of the potlatches that the natives have in the western part of North America, and how you're raised in society by how much you give away. and a potlatch is given at a wedding or a funeral or something like that. And the more you give away, the bigger you are in society. So it's a little bit different than the Western society, but the fundamental core is the same.
New Russians, 1990s, in Soviet, well, no longer Soviet Union at that point in time, when the whole think about the mafia, okay? Think about New Russians and, you know, the perestroika period in Russia. I mean, I'm using that as a very modern example. I mean, the New Russian walks into a coffee shop, buys a 50-cent cup of coffee and leaves a $300 tip. There was even a joke about two New Russians meet up and one of them says big Adidas suits, big thick chains on their necks, you know, bold, you know. One says, hey bro, I just bought me an Armani suit at that store. Guess how much I paid for it? I paid $50,000 for it. And the other says, ha bruh, you an idiot. I bought one around the corner for 100. That idea, the idea of wealth being not in the Protestant sense being a measure of your worth to begin with, but in the sense of it's back to the Vikings, it's your charisma. You know, the idea why giving out because at that point in time, the more you give away, that means the more worthy you are. So like in a lot of tribal societies, the guy with the least gold on him oftentimes will wind up being the tribal leader.
Yeah, and it's interesting that in the Inuit and also in Africa and Western Africa, if a male guest in the house, the husband will often give his wife to the male guest.
In a lot of cultures.
And that's sort of interesting, and that absolutely does not happen in some cultures and does in others. So it's interesting how this idea of hospitality is different in different places, but the fundamental core.
Moreover, if you're Persian, the wife might just give her husband to the wife of the visiting friend. I'm just saying. Ancient Persian, just to clarify, not any modern Persian people. But I think that one is pretty easy to explain. It's when you have closed societies, you know, with limited basically influx of new genes, and it makes sense to be able to try to widen that pool as much as possible. I mean, for example, I know that in earlier Rus, like even pre-Rus, when you had situations where nomads would, for example, roll onto a small town, medium-sized town, and slaughter everyone. And there would be just young women and girls left. If the first warrior that rode in, like let's say that's a situation we have like a medium-sized settlement, the enemies came, they just killed all the able men, you know, the women all ran off and hid somewhere nearby. And then let's say the cavalry of Slavs comes rolling in and kicks the enemies out of the place. All the girls will go to the leaders of basically they will go to the soldiers that just came in and say, kids, please, now, kids, now. Because that's the idea of needing to continue the lineage, because they know they're in the middle of nowhere. They know they're not going to have any new influx of any sort of new genes anytime soon. So that need to reproduce kind of thing explains that quite clearly. But I wonder how many wives give their husband away. I bet you more than than it's typically spoken about, for real. Yeah.
Might be a little bit taboo.
Take him already. Take him already. I don't want you to make him go away. Right.
I wanted to bring up something. I know that we're running out of time, but
you're fine, please.
The whole okay, what is a door, what is a threshold? And then we talked about, okay, certain zones, certain areas are under the control of certain people. And that reminded me of how psychologically speaking, a gateway for like a road or a driveway, whatever, that is also a big thing, especially in, you know, out in the woods where I've lived. It's like, even if the gate is open, you have to ask yourself, it's like, am I welcome to go in? Typically in a lot of places, an open gate that is obviously open is a direct sign that says, okay, visitors welcome, anybody can come in, we will make you a cup of tea, whatever. But you go up to a closed gate and it just flat out says, no hospitality available. If you need something, you have to holler or honk your horn or fire an SOS or something. But it's actually very powerful in some areas, not even just a doorway to a building, but just a gate on a road.
Right, and that's that idea of threshold. But like interesting things about the gates, I don't know if I mentioned this before or not, but and I'm drawing heavily onto Slavic folklore, particularly 19th century Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian folklore. The idea of why do you never stand at the threshold? You don't kiss or hug over threshold. Like if you're saying goodbye to somebody, you don't do it over the porch, you know. I mean, why you can't? It's wrong to spit over threshold. For example, it's horrible sin to spit over threshold. You guys know why that is, right? Because if you're a cave person, you live in a cave, you have one entrance to the cave, right? Okay, how are you going to protect the cave from evil spirits coming in when your grandma and grandpa die? You take grandma and grandpa and you bury them at the threshold. And now guess what? You have your personal set of guardian spirits. A lot of house spirits of folklore later on arise from those. Okay, why do you carry the bride over the threshold? You know, in American wedding tradition, what does the groom do? He picks up the bride and he carries her where? To the bedroom, right? Why can she not walk in with her own feet? Because those ancestors guarding that house will see her as a stranger. And they won't attack her.
Ritual.
Moreover, what you would do in Slavic ritual, you not only would you carry her over the threshold, you would carry her, because in Slavic hut, that would be, you know, very primitive hut. It's dugout, let's say. You have one entrance, a hole in the ceiling, if you're lucky, where the smoke goes out. Oftentimes it goes out the entrance. You have basically it's kind of your oven / stove with bed on top, because it's really cold climate, and like a bench to eat at, right? And then there's one corner that's dedicated to the gods, one corner where the man works on his stuff, and under it's a giant stove. We're talking about stove half the size of this room, okay? So you carry your bride in over the threshold, but she's still not out of the, you know, hot water, because the ancestors might not like that. So you carry her straight up to the stove, and she puts her hands up against the stove first thing. And now think about all those Australian or everywhere else cave art where you have handprints. Now think about this thing. You know this game right here? You play with the little kids? One of the oldest existing rituals in human history. Because when you live in a cave, you have you're far in the middle of the cave, people die, it's cold outside, you don't want to go outside, so you're going to bury your ancestors away from the center where people are sitting towards the walls, right? When you want to go talk to your ancestors, what are you going to do? You're going to put your hands up against their hands. That's what this is. That's you playing with your dead ancestors. But there's a lot of other things. I mean, for example, to this day in Russian tradition, a lot of Slavic traditions, you know, when girls try to tell their future, there's certainly, it's kind of like Halloweenish nights, though, from different set of folklore. And the girls are trying to figure out what's going to happen. That threshold, like throwing the boot over the threshold or throwing the boot over the gate.
Another thing that I've found pretty common, I actually do it myself, is warding thresholds. You know, you put up symbols, gargoyles, whatever. Everybody has their own version. I was kind of surprised to find out how different they can be, but they always go at some type of an entrance, some type of threshold. It's like we ward it so that only good things come in and bad things.
You know how you keep evil spirits out of your house, right? If you have any power at all yourself, right? Take a nice thick kitchen knife and you shove it right above the door into the, what is it called, that board that goes right on top of the door frame from the inside? That's kind of a magical lock.
Now, my ex was a shaman, and she would have, after January 1st every year, we would put salt on the threshold of the door and all the windowsills to keep out the evil spirit.
Yep. Or chalk, or sweeping all around the household. How do you carry out a dead body traditionally out of house? Head first or feet first? Chris, you turned off.
No, I have no idea. I never even thought of that.
Does anybody know how do you?
Feet first.
And do you carry them out the door or out the window? I mean, we're talking primitive hut. We're not talking about 14-story, 18-story buildings here. You take them feet first and you take them out the window, right? Because you don't want them to come back to the door. And the window is secondary in the sacred openings of the household, basically. As a matter of fact, why do you think the Santa flies in through the chimney? That's another thing to think about. Because Santa cannot get into the front door, right?
I've always wondered about that because I found out, you know, not that long ago that Santa Claus is mostly from Siberian, you know, stories. At least that's my understanding.
No.
It's a combination, a lot of German and
very far from. No, the Siberian Father Frost is very different than Father Frost is an old man who is scrawny, who walks around with a big thing, and he walks and everything dies. The end. That's your whole celebration.
Yeah, some of the Father Christmases were quite skinny and wore green as well in Europe, where the modern one is the chubby red guy with the big long beard.
Yeah, and he came from some pretty dark folklore too. You know, I mean, pretty scary dark folklore characters. But no, the Father Frost in like Slavic mythology, he walks and everything dies. The end. Like I said, I mean, that's your present. Your present is your dead.
Oh, thank you for clarifying. Obviously, my information is not always reliable.
Well, I don't think anybody's information these days is that reliable anymore. But I'm trying to think what else was the threshold.
Well, you think of the whole Halloween traditions. There's all kinds of things like that are woven into it with the other side, and then the appeasing spirits and all sorts of things.
Right. But that idea that the hospitality is intermixed with gods, is intermixed with fundamental events like the world flood, really. And how many, like, it will be interesting to think for the next one, just how many mythological creatures or entities in various religions and various worldviews really get either really blessed or really cursed for their lack of hospitality or their presence of hospitality, which gods are known to wander the world in the guise of homeless people. And what happens to those people who do not treat them nicely. And how we practice our hospitality today, and what some of our very average daily behaviors mean, and what signals we're sending to people around us. Because a lot of these things, even though, for example, in the West, a lot of these things have been rationalized and kind of put away in the backs of our minds, the instinctive responses to certain behaviors, I think, is still very much there.
Yeah, when we look at something that goes outside of our own space that we could still call hospitality, one thing that I've noticed has changed over my generation is what you could call traveling hospitality on the road, i.e., if there's a stranded motorist with their four-ways flashing, when I was a child, it was unthinkable to not stop. You did not do that. It was not allowed to not stop unless you were on your way to the hospital or something. But that has changed dramatically, because now there's no need for that hospitality. You have a cell phone, right? But when I was a child,
who you are. That's still very much the thing up here. Like, you see somebody parked, you pull over because they could die because there's no cell phone access.
Chris, I think you just brought up a very important point, that the more severe, the more hostile, the more demanding and challenging the environment is, the more precious is every individual's survival to the group. So in a city of however many million people, if somebody dies next street over, none of us is going to notice or honestly give care at all, right? But in a situation like yours, Chris, where there's people are kind of far dispersed, there's not that many people there, and each one is more or less known individually and precious to the community, that yes, every human life becomes extremely precious, and it becomes and community expands beyond. Today we live in a community of one. Oftentimes it's me, myself, and I. And the more the world moves forward, the more modernized, the more digitized we become, the more isolated people are becoming, because they feel like they no longer need that network. They don't. It's because that network, it's investment. It's hard work. It's hard work to maintain these etiquette rules, to maintain these connections, to remember these. 3 generations ago, your great grandfather visited my great father, and now I can come and pay back a visit, which is pretty common in a lot of cultures, used to be anyway. So I think that I don't know where humanity is moving to long term as far as evolving away from that group cohesion.
You're quite right. In places where life is difficult and we need each other to survive, the hospitality rules are definitely there.
And they come up sometimes almost.
They'll be back shortly.
They'll be back shortly, says David. Yeah.
Well, and the reason why hospitality is so sacred is because this is a chaotic world, and the further away you get from big cities, the less centralized the institutions are, and there's a great deal of conflict. And in order to travel and to navigate that world, and to flourish, and to develop relationships and all the stuff that we have to do, we need to be able to make friends. And so you need to be able to make alliances. And so
alliances, I think, would be a more accurate term in this case. Yeah.
And so when a stranger comes to town, it's an opportunity, make a friend, make an alliance, learn something about the world, get news, maybe, gain access to some innovation, might be reciprocal. And so, you host this person, you give them lots of food, you be really good to them. Maybe they stay a couple of days, who knows? And now perhaps you might have an ally later. So if you need a favor and you're traveling through this unstable and dangerous world, there's a person you can go crash with. And so the idea is the more people that do that, the bigger the social network, the easier it becomes, to negotiate and live with and move about this, this very uncertain world.
No, Nathan, and I agree with you, but I also think that I still think that your approach is a little bit almost too rational. I think a big part of it is kind of almost, I don't even know, it's predates Christianity, it predates any sort of formal faith or religion. It's the idea that if I send good out there, it's almost karmatic in its way. It's not even rational in the sense of I help him and down the road his, whatever relatives might help me. It's the idea if I help someone, then maybe down the road someone will help me. What goes around comes around, sort of thing. And I think a lot of it, and that's where the practical really blends with almost spiritual, not religious, but literally spiritual aspects of it, I think.
Does anybody here remember the term "pay it forward"?
Mm-hmm. In Jewish I forget the word for it, but in Judaism, there's a very specific word for it, for paying it forward.
In a lot of Caucasian languages, there's specific words for specific acts and, types of hospitality as well.
Yeah.
And you know what's interesting about hospitality? I don't know how many modern Western people actually have been engaged in the act of providing hospitality, not being on the receiving end. And moreover, it saddens me, but I think that a lot of modern Western people would be very uncomfortable on the receiving end of hospitality. But on the giving end of hospitality, that's why I think it's a biological adaptation, because you get the same endorphin boost. When you have somebody coming into your home and you engage in that activity of, oh my God, sit down here, let me go ahead and let me make you tea. It's rewarding on a physiological level. In the same way, for example, that, I don't know, eating ice cream is rewarding or any other positive stimuli are. I mean, that's something else we can think about. That the person providing the hospitality, the offering the hospitality, almost in the same way that a mother gets physiological rewards from, closeness with her infants. The same way that, lovers get endorphins from engaging, being intimate with each other, the same way that people get endorphins from doing something really well and excelling at it, the same way there's physiological, chemical stimulus that is built into people's systems that make people feel good when they do it. Am I making sense with what I'm saying here?
Makes perfect sense to me. I tend to be a lot happier when I'm making people around me happy.
Yeah. Right, but I think that's what makes me think that it's not just a behavior; it's almost an evolutionary trait. But I think that's about everything on my end. But I think we've got a while to go. I think this, like I said, we just wiggled our little toe on the big ocean of information and conversation here.
I'm sure Nathan's got a bunch of material.
Yeah, no, I know Nathan's got a bunch. I think we just got about first 2 lines of your outline.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think this is something going forward as we look at different cultures and advancing in time. It's something we should give a nod to, is how the hospitality and how that kind of thing works in each particular culture.
Yeah, and I think that now that we're dealing with cultures that we know a little bit more about, that we have just simply more written information about, or otherwise recorded, that would be a lot easier to do as well. Dealing with cultures that we know a little bit more about, that we have just simply more written information about, or otherwise recorded, that would be a lot easier to do as well. And also, it would be interesting to look for reasons why some cultures are non-hospitable. Like what causes a culture to, for example, like Andromandi, natives, the people who won't let anybody land on their little island and shoot at helicopters, shoot at boaters. What has to happen within a culture? How does the society have to, because being completely cocooned in is also very unhealthy, right? For get to any access to. What kind of trauma causes humans to cease that behavior altogether, and what the end results of that situation are?
What kind of environments, and the one that comes out, like the steppe cultures, they over 3,000-4,000 miles, they probably had hospitality systems that it was basically one system. So I'm sure landscape and environment plays a role in all that too.
I was about to say, with conflict with Native Americans, a lot of belief systems create how we define ourselves as people. You know, thinking and believing in a certain way. For me, supernatural stuff, you know, they exist. Hospitality rules for them because you just got to be careful. But even how people think and act, it's like the old way of thinking when it clashes against modern ways of thinking. And you know you're right, and they're questioning it, then you kind of say, okay, there's no way I'm going to talk to you about it, and I'm just going to not argue with you, and I'm just going to kind of lock you, you know, push you aside, you know, stay away from my culture if you're going to.
No, absolutely. And the thing that, you know, going off on a little mythological tangent, the thing that really scares me off about all modern Western cultures is that they are so, and this has been going on since beginning of the Age of Enlightenment and just kind of increasing quite significantly. But the idea that if you, just because you choose to not see something, it does not, if you close your eyes and like sit in a corner, it's not going to make me disappear. The same goes for all these other entities, levels of reality and spirits, right? Just because you sit there and say that guy was you know, was a bad, is not there, he's not going to hit me, it's not going to stop him from coming up and hitting you on the head. So in a way, to me, a lot of modern cultures, a lot of modern tendencies are very similar to that kid who is sitting in the corner closing his eyes and thinking that nobody can see him, nobody's going to hurt him just because he's covered his eyes up. So I think by ignoring those spiritual, very real spiritual interactions, positive, negative, neutral, and otherwise, mutually beneficial sometimes or mutually destructive, modern individuals of the modern society really expose themselves to a lot of nonsense. Now, sometimes ignorance is bliss, but oftentimes, most likely not, in my opinion, anyway.
I used to work for the Forest Service, and there was I used to work in the Heber, Arizona area where we had a research study going on. And there were two women who would drive from Flagstaff to Heber, Arizona. And you had to leave really early in the morning. And so when they were south of Holbrook, heading to Heber, they encountered, well, one woman was a PhD scientist, and she had just gotten over brain cancer, fighting it. And then the other one was what we call a technician. She already had her 4-year degree. And they were driving south, and then as they were driving south, this creature crossed the road in front of them. And the technician said it was like something like a bipedal, 3-foot-high creature with really thick, hairy legs and a real scrawny, old upper portion. And they stopped the vehicle because the thing was just kind of crossing the road in front of them, like real slow, because it was like it couldn't bend its knees and it had to swagger back and forth. And then when they finished crossing the road, they took off, and the scientists basically said, you know, what was that mutant thing? And the technician, I guess, didn't respond or anything like that. But when they got into the field and started working around noontime, the PhD scientist's vision started to go bad. And so right away, they both went back to Flagstaff, and I guess the cancer that was in her head came back. So I didn't know this happened until the technician came up to me one time and asked me, you know, what is this thing that we saw? And these things are like, you know, I guess the world classifies them as what they call the fae or fairy people. And from my understanding, you're not supposed to insult them. You know, don't say anything bad about them in any way. But that was interesting. But I've seen, like my mother has seen flying snakes. You know, we live in a tree. You know, where she grew up was a treeless desert, no trees. But she saw this snake flying through the air. And she said it was light green in color, like the color of fresh grass. and it had like a red fringe behind his head, and it was flying through the air about level of a person sitting on horseback. And she said it sounded like a taxiing jet on a taxiway. This high-pitched sound.
Where was this?
This is south of Loop, Arizona.
Well,
And
there's a lot of things out there, my dear friend Horatio, right?
yeah, apparently this thing is connected to the snake dances that the Hopis do.
There's so many different layers to reality.
Mhm.
You can coexist even mutually kind of exclusive things, because in mythology, oftentimes mutually exclusive concepts are layered on top of each other, and that's what makes it real mythology and not a Dungeons and Dragons little playbook thing. But
It's kind of funny too, because the episode was about hospitality, and now we're getting into, mythological.
mutually exclusive concepts are layered on top of each other, and that's what makes it real mythology and not a little, Dungeons and Dragons, little playbook thing. But
It's kind of funny too, because the episode was about hospitality, and now we're getting into, mythological, things again. I actually do have an old book. It was written in the 70s, I think, and it's about fairies and so on. And they actually get into a lot of the hospitality rituals when it comes to dealing with fairy folk. There are many do's and don'ts, because you want them on your side and you want them to help you. You don't want to tick them off, and they can be easy to insult.
Yeah, and even in contemporary literature, you look at how so much of Tolkien's work, like The Hobbit, is all about hospitality, all of it, and upholding it and the transgressions of.
well, see, and another thing that goes with hospitality. Sorry, guys, I haven't had like lunch, breakfast, or anything today, so I'm like starving. So I'm eating my hospitality bread as we speak. It's really fresh and yummy. But this is going to be my chewy episode. But what I was going to say is that about inviting things into your house. I mean, we see this in horror films, but if you think about it in real life, how many times you have a situation where you have teenage kids, oftentimes boys, sometimes girls, who are messing with something, even if it's totally imaginary. Let's say it's some, I don't know, bubble gum monster man, and they're sitting, you got your 11, 12-year-old girl sitting around, in the dark bedroom going, ooh, the bubble gum man is going to get you. There's a reason why it's a very cliche plot in a lot of movies that's about when something weird happens in something like the bubblegum evil monster man, or just bottom line is don't invite things into your home you don't want there. And I think a lot of the hospitality rules and rituals are about thinking, first of all, having a framework, behavioral framework to fall back onto in a situation which was likely to be very uncomfortable to both the host and the visitor if it's not a planned visit, right? So it's having that assurance, that scaffold you can kind of cling on to as far as how you behave, knowing what to expect. You don't have this uncertainty anymore. And also stopping and thinking about what you do, how you do it, and what the implications are going to be, which is something that we're starting to forget entirely in the modern world.
Right, and so just to maybe end with and add to what you just said, for this episode, it's in today, even today, it's a very chaotic and unstable world, and everyone, all of ourselves, everyone, we can use more way stations along the way. People who are willing to literally and metaphorically take us in. We can all use a good rest.
Absolutely.
Agreed, Nathan. I would call it more truck stops on the road of life.
Right.
Very briefly, Ryan, about thresholds and the front door. So the English have a saying that royalty through the front door, family through the back.
Sorry, and I kind of want to throw in towards the end. It's a Russian saying that refers to a situation when everybody's got done eating dinner together, and the guests got up, and you're standing by the front door, and they say the saying goes that the standing guest is worse than a Mongolian, and I'm saying I'm not discriminating against Mongolian people, but the Russians did kind of have a whole Mongolian invasion thing. But the idea is that, you know, it's time to come and then it's time to go, sort of thing. And knowing when the right time to do both sometimes is a life-saving experience and expertise to have. Yeah. So do not be the standing invading horde, you know, by the door when all your hosts are like, okay, out now, please. So.
Yes, our contemporary corollary to that is guests are like fish. They start smelling bad after 3 days.
I'm about to say, concerning thresholds, you guys were talking about cleansing a home. We do it with cedar smoke, but you apply it like you're painting a house. When you paint the floor, you start at one corner and work your way out toward the door. And then that way, you know, you're not painting the spirit into a corner.
Right.
And then once you're done with that, then we used to seal it with ash.
Right.
You know, to keep the, you know, lock it out.
Right, driving them out, but you got to give them a way out. Otherwise, they're going. Like you said, it's like horned rat. It's dangerous. Yeah.
Is it just the floor or is it the walls also?
The floor is an analogy. You know, like if somebody's painting a floor and you don't want to paint yourself into a corner.
Mm-hmm.
So when you apply the cedar smoke, you start in a corner and then you kind of work your way out.
Right.
Leave the entrance open, and you know, leave it open, and then continue that process until you've cleaned the whole house.
Right. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much. It's awesome to see everyone. Looking forward to talking some more next week, week after next. Yeah.
Yeah, great episode. That was a lot of fun. Great to see you, Julie. Great to see everybody else. Please be well.
Hey, and Nathan, thank you for this idea. Thank you for all the research you've put in. I'm looking forward to hearing more about what you have discovered, and because it's interesting to compare different perspectives. Yeah. All right, I'm letting everyone go. Thanks, guys. Bye.
All right, goodbye.
Bye.
Good night.
Night.
Both cast our shadows as our legends unfold. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul.